Hello dear students, I welcome you for yet another lecture on study of Pila globosa. Let's take a recap of previous lecture. In previous lecture, we have started with the blood vascular system. So we have studied the salient features of blood vascular system of Pila globosa. We studied the organs and accessory structures of the blood vascular system, their structure and function, and we studied the different branches of cephalic aorta and visceral aorta in detail. The study objectives of today's lecture will be to study the structure and function of sinuses and veins, types of sinuses and veins, composition of the blood and its functions, and finally we are going to study the actual course of circulation in aquatic respiration and in aerial respiration. So let's begin with the first point, that is sinuses and veins. So we know that the pila has a blood vascular system which is made up of sinuses. So at the junction of arteries and veins, you find these sinuses which play a very important role. So blood, after being distributed to various parts of the body through arteries and their branches, then it will finally pass into small lacunae, and these smaller lacunae will united together to form large sinuses. Now there are in all 4 chief or major sinuses in the body of pila. The first one is Peri-Visceral Sinus, which is present in the anterior part of alimentary canal and on the floor of mantle. The second is called as Peri-Intestinal Sinus, which is situated along the intestinal coiling. Third sinus is called as Branchio-Renal Sinus. It is situated on the right side of anterior renal chamber. And the fourth one is a Pulmonary Sinus, which is present on the wall of pulmonary sac, or it is also referred to as lung. Now let's study each one in detail. So the first sinus is Peri-Visceral Sinus, which lies above the foot and beneath the floor of the pallial cavity. And the function of this Peri-Visceral Sinus is to collect the blood which is supplied by the cephalic aorta. Now we will study the circulation or the course of circulation in pila. That time this will be more clear to you. The second type of sinus is called as Peri-Intestinal Sinus, which is present on the columnar axis of the next to the intestine, and it collects the blood from the viscera and the one which is distributed by the visceral aorta. So whatever blood is collected from the viscera is then distributed by the visceral aorta. Third is Branchio-Renal Sinus. It is present along the right side of anterior renal chamber. Now this renal chamber is nothing but part of the excretory system of pila, and it collects blood obviously from renal chamber. The fourth sinus is called as Pulmonary Sinus, which is present in the wall of pulmonary sac or lung, and it collects the blood from the pulmonary sac. Now let's study the second point of today's discussion, that is veins in Pila globosa. Now we know that veins collect the venous blood from different parts of the body, that is nothing but the deoxygenated blood, and they will send it to the gill or pulmonary sac in case of pila. Because in pila there is a dual mode of respiration, so it takes place by aquatic mode takes place with the help of gill, and aerial respiration with the help of pulmonary sac. We have studied in the last lecture. So this Deoxygenated blood is not only sent to the pulmonary sac or gill, but it is also sent to the mantle and renal sac, and finally it will get collected into the first chamber of the heart, that is auricle. So now let's see the main veins which are present in Pila. The first vein is called as pulmonary vein. So as the name suggests, it starts from the pulmonary sac and it ends to the auricle. The second vein is called as afferent tenoidal vein. So obviously it will taking the blood from the tenoidium, but it will start from the peri-visceral sinus, then it will go to branchiorenal sinus, rectum, genital duct, and finally it will send it to the gill during this only aquatic mode of respiration. So afferent tenoidal vein takes part only in the aquatic respiration. Similarly, the efferent tenoidal vein also taking part only in aquatic respiration. It carries the blood from gill, mantle and copulatory organ to the auricle. So here you should remember that this afferent tenoidal vein is carrying the deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body to the gill for the oxygenation, and efferent tenoidal vein carries this oxygenated blood to the auricle. Next is afferent renal vein. It carries the blood from peri-intestinal sinus to posterior renal chamber. Now why it is carrying the blood? Because the blood will have the impurities in it. So those excess ions or salts need to be excreted from the body. So that function takes place in this renal chamber. So half of the blood is carried to the gill and remaining half of the blood is carried to the renal chamber by this afferent renal vein. So we will understand it when we will see the diagram of circulation. And last vein of this Pila globosa is called as efferent renal vein. So they are exactly opposite. Afferent renal vein is carrying the deoxygenated blood, and this efferent renal vein is carrying this from posterior renal chamber to the auricle. So afferent renal vein carrying it to the renal chamber and efferent renal vein carrying it from posterior renal chamber to the auricle. In this diagram you can see these different renal different types of veins which are present in the Pila globosa. So here you can see efferent tenoidal vein, afferent tenoidal vein. Similarly, you have a pulmonary vein. Okay, so let's study each vein in detail. So the first vein is afferent tenoidal vein. If we see the position of this vein, it is situated above the rectum and receives the different branches from rectum, terminal part of genital duct, peri-visceral sinus and branchiorenal sinus. Now after receiving this blood, it will send this blood through various branches to the gill for oxygenation. So the sole role of afferent tenoidal vein is to carry the deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body which are mentioned here, and from these parts it will carry it to the or send it to the gill for oxygenation. Now since there is name this tenoidal means this vein takes part only in the aquatic respiration. Now exactly opposite to this afferent tenoidal vein you have the efferent tenedial vein, which is present on the roof of anterior renal chamber, part of the excretory system, and it is carrying the blood from the tenedium to the auricle. Next, afferent renal vein, situated on the roof of posterior renal chamber and originated from peri-intestinal sinus, and it carries the blood into the posterior renal chamber. Now the role of this afferent renal vein is to carry the blood, half of the blood, to the renal chamber for the purification. And exactly opposite to the afferent renal vein is efferent renal vein, which carries the blood from posterior renal chamber to the auricle. Last is the pulmonary vein, which carries the blood from pulmonary sac to the auricle. So this pulmonary vein takes part only in the aerial respiration, and the tenedial veins take part only in the aquatic respiration. In this table, you will get a complete overview of different veins and their route. So, from where the blood is collected, the collecting vein, as well as the collected blood is sent to which part, finally it is collected by which vein and carried to the auricle. So let's see the course of circulation. I have simplified it more, so we will study from that table. Okay, so before going into course of circulation, let's study the blood in Pila globosa. So blood, we know that it is liquid connective tissue. Blood of Pila consists of two components, that is plasma and corpuscles. It is light blue in color and slightly alkaline in nature. Now it shows dual color, so it appears bluish due to presence of hemocyanin, which is in the dissolved form in the plasma. So what is this hemocyanin? This is a copper containing respiratory pigment. Okay, so hemocyanin is the copper containing respiratory pigment present in especially in the gastropods, to which Pila belongs, and this hemocyanin is normally in the dissolved state in the plasma. Yes, so it is a compound of copper and some proteins, and this pigment has affinity for oxygen. But if we compare this hemocyanin with the hemoglobin in mammals, we can see that hemoglobin has higher affinity for oxygen compared to the hemocyanin. So hemocyanin has a lower tendency for carrying the oxygen. Okay, now the blood of Pila is also referred to by another name, that is hemolymph. So you may come across this terminology, hemolymph. So blood of Pila is also called as hemolymph. And there are number of salts dissolved in the blood. Okay, now let's see the different types of corpuscles. So there are basically 4 types of corpuscles which are present in Pila, and these corpuscles are also called as hemocytes. The first corpuscle is called as lymphocytes. These are small oval corpuscles with clear cytoplasm. So there are no granules in the cytoplasm of lymphocytes. Now if we see the nucleus is spherical and dense. So these are the feature of lymphocyte. Second corpuscles are eosinophils. Eosinophils, these are the also called by another name as amoeboid cells because they show irregular shape. And They are larger cells with granular cytoplasm, as well as they have round or bean-shaped nucleus. So these are the features of eosinophils. These are slightly irregular in shape. They have granular cytoplasm, means presence of small granules which can be easily observed if when you stain the eosinophils, and the nucleus size is round or bean shaped. And these eosinophils have the capacity or tendency to produce pseudopodia. Okay, so they are able to produce pseudopodia. Now let's come to the third type of corpuscles, which are called as basophils. Why this name basophils? They can be stained with basic dyes. So they are spherical in shape with granular cytoplasm, and they possess prominent oval nucleus as well as nucleolus. So the nucleus is very prominent and it is oval shaped. Basophils also have the tendency they can produce the pseudopodia, which are nothing but the projections coming out of the cell. And you have the fourth type of corpuscles, which are called as amoebocytes. So why amoebocytes? Because they are irregular in shape. So they can be of various shapes and sizes, and they contain granular cytoplasm. So this cytoplasm is showing the granules in them, and nuclei are of various sizes and shapes. They are also capable of producing long pseudopodia, so they appear like the shape of amoeba, irregular in shape, and their cytoplasm show a prominent feature, that is presence of vacuoles. So this is the characteristic feature to identify a amoebocyte. And they play a very important role in blood clotting and phagocytosis in Pila. Okay, now let's study the different functions which are carried out by the blood. So the blood transport food and nutrients from digestive system to various parts of the body. It also transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. That is one of the important role of blood. Thirdly, it carries excess of food for storage into the storage organs. Okay, so that can be act as a reserved food which can be used later. Then the important work of excretion. It carries all the nitrogenous waste which are produced in the body to the excretory system, that is to the nephridium. Then it also keeps all the tissues moist, and thus it protects the animal from microorganisms or pathogens. Next, it serves like a hydrostatic skeleton, because that is the skeleton made up of liquid. So all the body parts can be made rigid with the circulation. So it helps in the locomotion in Pila. So due to this hydrostatic skeleton formed by the circulation of blood, it helps in the locomotion. Also, foot, respiratory siphon and copulatory penis can use blood for different functions. So these are all the important functions of the blood. Okay, now we move on to the last and important part of today's discussion, that is course of circulation in Pila. So all parts of the body are supplied the blood from ventricle. So we all know that the auricle is the first receiving chamber, followed by the ventricle. From ventricle we have the cephalic and visceral aorta, which further supplied the blood to different parts of the body through different arteries. Now the cephalic aorta, we know it carries blood to the cephalic region, that is the head region. So it carries blood to head and the associated structures like mantle, buccal mass, esophagus and copulatory organ. Now the course of circulation in case of Pila can be of two types. So in this next picture you can see both these course of circulation together. So the pulmonary circulation or the aerial circulation and the aquatic circulation, that is the tenedial circulation. So in the next diagram I will separate these because in Pila either of these pathway will take place because Pila respires by only one way when it is respiring. So it can respire either aquatic mode or it can respire by the aerial mode. So suppose if how does the blood circulation occurs when the aquatic respiration takes place? Let's study with the help of this chart. So we know that from the auricle, blood first goes to the ventricle. From this ventricle chamber, it goes to the aortic trunk. Aortic trunk is further divided into two branches, visceral aorta and cephalic aorta. Visceral aorta carries blood to the posterior body parts and cephalic means head region, so it will carry blood to the anterior body part, that is head and other regions of the front body part. Okay, now once the blood comes into this visceral aorta, it will first go to the sinus. Okay, so these are like a connecting junctions between the veins and the arteries. So you have the blood from the visceral aorta first collected in peri-intestinal sinus. From this peri-intestinal sinus, it can go into either afferent renal sinus or it can go into the afferent renal vein. Once it enters into afferent renal vein, it will go into the posterior renal chamber, and from this posterior renal chamber, okay, now from afferent renal vein it can go to the posterior renal chamber, and we have seen that from peri-intestinal sinus blood can go either to afferent renal sinus, and from afferent renal sinus it will go into anterior renal chamber. Now from this anterior renal chamber it will enter into the posterior renal chamber. So some of the blood can go to the posterior renal chamber. Now why does it goes into this renal chamber? Because half of the blood goes for the to remove the excretory waste, and remaining half of the blood can go directly for the oxygenation. So here the 50% blood can goes to the posterior renal chamber for the excretory waste removal, and remaining blood enters into branchiorenal sinus. From branchiorenal sinus, this blood goes to the afferent tenedial vein. We know that afferent tenedial vein will carry the blood for the oxygenation, or it will carry the deoxygenated blood to the tenedium, which is also called as gill, and in this gill the oxygenation of the blood takes place, and this oxygenated blood then will leave the system through efferent tenedial vein. From efferent tenedial vein it will enter into the first chamber of the heart again, that is auricle. Okay, now we have to see in the other aorta. Okay, so some of the blood is going through the visceral aorta, remaining blood is entering into the cephalic aorta. Now the blood which is entering into the cephalic aorta first goes to the peri-visceral sinus. From peri-visceral sinus, there are two routes followed. It can go to either anterior renal chamber, part of the excretory system, or it can go to the directly go to the bronchorenal sinus. Now, whatever amount of blood which is going for this excretory system will enter into the posterior renal chamber. So this will be the, here the blood is deoxygenated blood, and whatever blood going from anterior renal chamber to bronchorenal sinus is the still deoxygenated blood, but it will go to afferent tenedial vein, then to tenedium, where the oxygenation will take place. So this will become oxygenated blood, and this oxygenated blood will go to the auricle through efferent tenedial vein. But suppose 50% of the blood which auricle receiving is the oxygenated blood, but remaining 50% blood which is coming from posterior renal chamber is still deoxygenated blood, and that deoxygenated blood is also going into the circulation in the auricle. So the type of blood is called as a mixed blood. So the auricle receives the mixed blood, that is 50% oxygenated blood from tenedium and 50% deoxygenated blood from the posterior renal chamber. Okay, so this is all about blood circulation in during the aquatic respiration. Now we will see the second scenario. Suppose the pila is doing the aerial respiration. Now this pulmonary circulation will also start from auricle. The blood will enter to the ventricle, then it will go to the aortic trunk. We know that aortic trunk is further divided into two branches, visceral aorta and cephalic aorta. From visceral aorta, the mechanism is quite similar to your aquatic respiration circulation. So visceral aorta, which is providing blood to posterior body parts, cephalic aorta supplying blood to anterior body parts. So let's first see the visceral aorta. So the blood enters similarly here into peri-intestinal sinus. From it can go to two ways, that is half of the blood will go afferent renal sinus, half of the blood will go to the afferent renal vein. From this, the blood will enter to the posterior renal chamber, and it will directly go to again back to the auricle. The remaining blood which was present in afferent renal sinus will first go into the anterior renal chamber, which is the anterior part of the renal chamber. From anterior part it will go to the posterior part of the renal chamber, and it will join. So this entire blood present here is the deoxygenated blood, will go into the circulation via auricle. Now this remaining blood carried by the cephalic aorta actually goes for the oxygenation. So it will first go to the peri-visceral sinus, from which it enters into the pulmonary sac or lung, where the oxygenation of the blood will take place, and it will enter into the pulmonary vein. So we know that pulmonary vein carries the blood to the auricle. Again this blood is the oxygenated blood. The blood carried by the posterior renal chamber is the deoxygenated blood. So both blood mix together. So this is also called mixed blood circulation. And this blood is pumped to the ventricle and again back into the circulation. So this is all about the pulmonary respiration circulation in Pila globosa. So if we conclude today's lecture, we have understood. So in today's lecture, we understood what are sinuses and their types, followed by veins and their different types. So 5 types of veins are present. Then we studied the blood and its structure and function, or rather composition of the blood and its functions, followed by we studied the course of circulation. So there are two types of circulation. One which takes place during the aquatic mode of respiration, and the other which takes place during the aerial mode of respiration. So with this we conclude today's second lecture on blood vascular system of Pila. Thank you.